Intuition is the method of Bergsonism. Intuition is neither a feeling, an inspiration, nor a disorderly sympathy, but a fully developed method. One of the most fully developed methods in philosophy. It has its strict rules, constituting what Bergson calls precision in philosophy. Bergson emphasizes this point. Intuition, as he understands it methodologically, already presupposes duration. These conclusions on the subject of duration as it seemed to me decisive. Step by step, they led me to raise intuition to the level of a philosophical method. The use of the word intuition, however, caused me some degree of hesitation. And to Hofting he writes, "The theory of intuition which you stress, more than that of duration, only became clear to me long afterwards. First and second have many meanings. Intuition certainly is second in relation to duration or to memory. But while these notions by themselves denote lived realities and experiences, they do not give us any means of knowing, connaître, them with a precision analogous to that of science. We might say, strangely enough, that duration would remain purely intuitive, in the ordinary sense of the word, if intuition, in the properly Bergsonian sense, were not there as method. The fact is that Bergson relied on the intuitive method to establish philosophy as an absolutely precise discipline, as precise in its field, as capable of being prolonged and transmitted, as science itself is. And without the methodical thread of intuition, the relationships between duration, memory, and élan vital would themselves remain indeterminate from the point of view of knowledge. In all these respects, we must bring intuition as rigorous or precise method to the forefront of our discussion. The most general methodological question is this: how is intuition, which primarily denotes an immediate knowledge, connaissance, capable of forming a method once it is accepted that the method essentially involves one or several mediations? Bergson often presents intuition as a simple act, but in his view, simplicity does not exclude a qualitative and virtual multiplicity, various directions, in which it comes to be actualized. It is in this sense, then, that intuition involves a plurality of meanings and irreducible multiple aspects. Bergson distinguishes essentially three distinct sorts of acts that in turn determine the rules of the method. The first concerns the stating and creating of problems. The second, the discovery of genuine differences in kind. The third, the apprehension of real time. It is by showing how we move from one meaning to another and what the fundamental meaning is, that we are able to rediscover the simplicity of intuition as a lived act, and thus answer the general methodological question. First rule: apply the test of true and false to problems themselves. Condemn false problems and reconcile truth and creation. At the level of problems, we are wrong to believe that the true and the false can only be brought to bear on solutions, that they only begin with solutions. This prejudice is social for society and the language that transmits. Its order words, mot d'ordre, set up, donnant, ready-made problems as if they were drawn out of the city's administrative filing cabinets, and force us to solve them, leaving us only a thin margin of freedom. Moreover, this prejudice goes back to childhood, to the classroom. It is the school teacher who poses the problems. The pupil's task is to discover the solutions. In this way, we are kept in a kind of slavery. True freedom lies in a power to decide, to constitute problems themselves. And this semi-divine power entails the disappearance of false problems, as much as the creative upsurge of true ones. The truth is that in philosophy and even elsewhere, it is a question of finding the problem, and consequently of positing it. even more than of solving it. For a speculative problem is solved as soon as it is properly stated. By that I mean that its solution exists then, although it may remain hidden and, so to speak, covered up. The only thing left to do is to uncover it. But stating the problem is not simply uncovering, it is inventing. Discovery or uncovering has to do with what already exists, actually or virtually. It was therefore certain to happen sooner or later. Invention gives being to what did not exist. It might never have happened. Already in mathematics, and still more in metaphysics, the effort of invention consists most often in raising the problem, in creating the terms in which it will be stated. The stating and solving of the problem are here very close to being equivalent. The truly great problems are set forth only when they are solved. It is not just the whole history of mathematics that supports Bergson. We might compare the last sentence of this extract from Bergson with Marx's formulation, which is valid for practice itself. Humanity itself problems that it is capable of solving. In neither example is it a case of saying that problems are like the shadow of pre-existing solutions. The whole context suggests the contrary, nor is it a case of saying that only the problems count. On the contrary, it is the solution that counts, but the problem always has the solution it deserves, in terms of the way in which it is stated, i.e. the conditions under which it is determined as problem, and of the means and terms at our disposal for stating it. In this sense, the history of man, from the theoretical as much as from the practical point of view, is that of the construction of problems. It is here that humanity makes its own history, and the becoming conscious of that activity is like the conquest of freedom. It is true that in Bergson, the very notion of the problem has its roots beyond history, in life itself or in the élan vital. Life is essentially determined in the act of avoiding obstacles, stating and solving a problem. The construction of the organism is both the stating of a problem and a solution. But how can this constitutive power which resides in the problem be reconciled with a norm of the true, while it is relatively easy to define the true and the false in relation to solutions, whose problems have already been stated? It seems much more difficult to say in what the true and false consist, when applied to the process of stating problems. This is how many philosophers fall into circular arguments, conscious of the need to take the test of true and false. Beyond solutions into problems themselves, they are content to define the truth or falsity of a problem by the possibility or impossibility of its being solved. Bergson's great virtue, on the other hand, is to have attempted an intrinsic determination of the false in the expression false problem. This is the source of a rule that is complementary to the preceding general rule. Complementary rule: false problems are of two sorts. Non-existent problems, defined as problems whose very terms contain a confusion of the more and the less and badly stated questions, so defined because their terms represent badly analyzed composites. To illustrate the first kind of problem, Bergson cites the problems of non-being, of disorder, or of the possible, the problems of knowledge and being as examples of the second type. There are the problems of freedom or of intensity. His analyses of these are famous. In the first case, they consist in showing that there is not less but more in the idea of non-being than that of being, in disorder than in order, in the possible than in the real. In the idea of non-being there is in fact the idea of being, plus a logical operation of generalized negation, plus the particular psychological motive for that operation, such as when a being does not correspond to our expectation and we grasp it purely as the lack, the absence of what interests us. In the idea of disorder, there is already the idea of order, plus its negation, plus the motive for that negation. When we encounter an order that is not the one we expected, and there is more in the idea of the possible than there is in the idea of the real. For the possible is only the real with the addition of an act of mind that throws its image back into the past, once it has been enacted, and the motive of that act. When we confuse the upsurge of a reality in the universe with a succession of states in a closed system. When we ask, why is there something rather than nothing? Or why is there order rather than disorder? Or why is there this rather than that? When that was equally possible, we fall into the same error. We mistake the more for the less. We behave as though non-being existed before being, disorder before order, and the possible before existence, as though being came to fill in a void, order to organize a preceding disorder, the real to realize a primary possibility. Being, order, or the existent, are truth itself. But in the false problem, there is a fundamental illusion, a retrograde movement of the true, according to which being, order, and the existent are supposed to precede themselves, or to precede the creative act that constitutes them by projecting an image of themselves back into a possibility, a disorder, a non-being, which are supposed to be primordial. This theme is a central one in Bergson's philosophy. It sums up his critique of the negative and of negation, in all its forms as sources of false problems. Badly stated problems, the second type of false problem, introduce a different mechanism. This time it is a case of badly analyzed composites that arbitrarily group things that differ in kind. Take, for example, the question of whether happiness is reducible to pleasure or not. Perhaps the term pleasure subsumes very varied, irreducible states, just like the idea of happiness. If the terms do not correspond to natural articulations, then the problem is false, or it does not affect the very nature of things. Here again, Bergson's analyses are famous. For example, the one in which he condemns intensity as such a composite. Whether the quality of the sensation is confused with the muscular space that corresponds to it, or with the quantity of the physical cause that produces it. The notion of intensity involves an impure mixture between determinations that differ in kind, so that the question, by how much does the sensation grow, always goes back to a badly stated problem. Likewise, the problem of freedom, in which two types of multiplicity are confused, that the terms juxtaposed in space, and that of states which merge together in duration. Let us return to the first type of false problem. Here Bergson says, the more is mistaken for the less. But there are also times when Bergson says that the less here is mistaken for the more. Just as doubt about an action only apparently adds to the action, when in reality it indicates a half-willing, negation is not added to what it denies, but only indicates a weakness in the person who denies. For we feel that a divinely created will or thought is too full of itself in the immensity of its reality to have the slightest idea of a lack of order or a lack of being. To imagine the possibility of absolute disorder, all the more the possibility of nothingness would be for it to say to itself that it might not have existed at all, and that would be a weakness incompatible with its nature, which is force. It is not something more but something less. It is a deficit of the will. Is there a contradiction between these two formulations, where non-being is sometimes presented as a more in relation to being and sometimes as a less? There is no contradiction if we bear in mind that what Bergson is condemning in non-existent problems is the obsession in all its aspects with thinking in terms of more or less. The idea of disorder appears when, instead of seeing that there are two or more irreducible orders, for example that of life and that of mechanism, each present when the other is absent, we retain only a general idea of order, that we confine ourselves to opposing to disorder, and to thinking in correlation with the idea of disorder. The idea of non-being appears when, instead of grasping the different realities that are indefinitely substituted for one another, we muddle them together in the homogeneity of a being in general, which can only be opposed to nothingness, be related to nothingness. The idea of the possible appears when, instead of grasping each existent in its novelty, the whole of existence is related to a preformed element from which everything is supposed to emerge by simple realization. In short, each time that we think in terms of more or less, we have already disregarded the differences in kind between the two orders, or between beings, between existence. In this way, we can see how the first type of false problem rests in the final analysis on the second. The idea of disorder emerges from a general idea of order as badly analyzed, composite, etc. And conceiving everything in terms of more or less, seeing nothing but differences in degree or differences in intensity, where most profoundly there are differences in kind, is perhaps the most general error of thought, the error common to science and metaphysics. We are therefore victims of a fundamental illusion that corresponds to the two aspects of the false problem. The very notion of the false problem indeed implies that we have to struggle, not against simple mistakes, false solutions, but against something more profound, an illusion that carries us along, or in which we are immersed, inseparable from our condition, a mirage, as Bergson describes, the projection backward of the possible. Bergson borrows an idea from Kant. Although he completely transforms it, it was Kant who showed that reason, deep within itself, engenders not mistakes, but inevitable illusions, only the effect of which could be warded off. Although Bergson determines the nature of false problems in a completely different way, and although the Kantian critique itself seems to him to be a collection of badly stated problems, he treats the illusion in a way similar to Kant. The illusion is based in the deepest part of the intelligence. It is not, strictly speaking, dispelled or dispellable. Rather, it can only be repressed. We tend to think in terms of more or less, that is, to see differences in degree when there are differences in kind. We can only react against this intellectual tendency by bringing to life again in the intelligence another tendency, which is critical. But where precisely does this second tendency come from? Only intuition can produce and activate it, because it rediscovers differences in kind beneath the differences in degree, and conveys to the intelligence the criteria that enable it to distinguish between true and false problems. Bergson shows clearly that the intelligence is the faculty that states problems in general. The instinct is rather a faculty for finding solutions, but only intuition decides between the true and the false in the problems that are stated, even if this means driving the intelligence to turn back against itself. Second rule: struggle against illusion, rediscover the true differences in kind or articulations of the real. The Bergsonian dualisms are famous: duration, space; quality, quantity; heterogeneous, homogeneous; continuous, discontinuous; the two multiplicities; memory, matter; recollection, perception; contraction, relaxation, détente; instinct, intelligence, the two sources, etc. Even the running heads that Bergson puts at the top of each page of his books indicate his taste for dualisms which do not, however, have the last word in his philosophy. What therefore do they mean? According to Bergson, a composite must always be divided according to its natural articulations, that is, into elements which differ in kind. Intuition as method is a method of division. Platonic in inspiration, Bergson is aware that things are mixed together in reality. In fact, experience itself offers us nothing but composites. But that is not where the difficulty lies. For example, we make time into a representation imbued with space. The awkward thing is that we no longer know how to distinguish in that representation the two component elements which differ in kind, the two pure presences of duration and extensity. We mix extensity and duration so thoroughly that we can now only oppose their mixture to a principle that is assumed to be both non-spatial and non-temporal, and in relation to which space and time, duration and extensity are now only deteriorations. To take yet another example, we mix recollection and perception, but we do not know how to recognize what goes back to perception and what goes back to recollection. We no longer distinguish between the two pure presences of matter and memory in representation, and we no longer see anything but differences in degree between perception recollections and recollection perceptions. In short, we measure the mixtures with a unit that is itself impure and already mixed. We have lost the ground of composites. The obsession with the pure in Bergson goes back to this restoration of differences in kind. Only that which differs in kind can be said to be pure, but only tendencies differ in kind. The composite must therefore be divided according to qualitative and qualified tendencies, that is, according to the way in which it combines duration and extensity, as they are defined as movements, directions of movements, hence duration, contraction, and matter expansion, détente. Again, there is some resemblance between intuition as method of division and transcendental analysis. If the composite represents the fact, it must be divided into tendencies or into pure presences that only exist in principle, en droit. We go beyond experience towards the conditions of experience, but these are not, in the Kantian manner, conditions of all possible experience. They are the conditions of real experience. This is the Bergsonian leitmotif. People have seen only differences in degree where there are differences in kind, and Bergson groups his major critiques, which take many different forms, under this heading. His fundamental criticism of metaphysics is that it sees differences in degree between a spatialized time and an eternity, which it assumes to be primary. Time as deterioration, relaxation, détente, or diminution of being. All beings are defined on a scale of intensity between the two extremes of perfection and nothingness. But he directs a similar criticism at science. There is no definition of mechanism other than that which invokes a spatialized time, according to which beings no longer present anything but differences of degree, of position, of dimension, of proportion. There is even mechanism in evolutionism to the extent that it postulates a unilinear evolution and takes us from one living organization to another by simple intermediaries, transitions, and variations of degree. The whole source of the false problem and the illusions that overwhelm us lie in this disregard for true differences in kind. As early as the first chapter of Matter and Memory, Bergson shows how the forgetting of differences in kind, on the one hand between perception and affection, on the other hand between perception and recollection, gives rise to all kinds of false problems by making us think that our perception is inextensive in character, There are, in the idea that we project outside ourselves, states, which are purely internal. So many misconceptions, so many lame answers to badly stated questions. No text shows more clearly than this first chapter of Matter and Memory how complex the manipulation of intuition is. As a method of division, the representation has to be divided into the elements that condition it, into pure presences or tendencies that differ in kind. How does Bergson proceed? He asks first, between what two things there may be or may not be a difference in kind. His first response is that since the brain is an image among other images, or ensures certain movements among other movements, there cannot be a difference in kind between the faculty of the brain, which is said to be perceptive, and the reflex functions of the core. Thus, the brain does not manufacture representations, but only complicates the relationship between a received movement, excitation, and an executed movement, response. Between the two, it establishes an interval, écart, whether it divides up the received movement infinitely or prolongs it in a plurality of possible reactions, even if recollections take advantage of this interval or, strictly speaking, interpolate themselves. Nothing changes. We can, for the moment, discount them as being involved in another line. On the line that we are tracing, we can only have matter and movement which is more or less complicated, more or less delayed. The whole question is knowing whether, in this way, we also already have perception. By virtue of the cerebral interval, in effect, a being can retain from a material object and the actions issuing from it only those elements that interest him, so that perception is not the object plus something, but the object minus something, minus everything that does not interest us. It could be said that the object itself merges with a pure, virtual perception, at the same time as our real perception merges with the object from which it has abstracted only that which did not interest us. Hence Bergson's famous thesis, the full consequences of which we will have to analyze. We perceive things where they are. Perception puts us at once into matter, is impersonal, and coincides with the perceived object. Continuing on this same line, the whole of Bergson's method consists, first of all, in seeking the terms between which there could not be a difference in kind. There cannot be a difference in kind, but only a difference in degree, between the faculty of the brain and the function of the core, between the perception of matter and matter itself. We are now in a position to trace out the second line, which differs in kind from the first. In order to establish the first, we needed fictions. We assumed that the body was like a pure mathematical point in space, a pure instant, or a succession of instants in time. But these fictions were not simply hypotheses. They consisted in pushing beyond experience a direction, drawn from experience itself. It is only in this way that we can extract a whole aspect of the conditions of experience. All that is left now is to ask ourselves, what fills up the cerebral interval? What takes advantage of it to become embodied? Bergson's response is threefold. First, there is affectivity, which assumes that the body is something other than a mathematical point, which gives it volume in space. Next, it is the recollections of memory that link the instants to each other and interpolate the past in the present. Finally, it is memory again, in another form, in the form of a contraction of matter that makes the quality appear. It is therefore memory that makes the body something other than instantaneous and gives it a duration in time. We are consequently in the presence of a new line, that of subjectivity, on which affectivity, recollection memory, and contraction memory are arranged. These terms may be said to differ in kind from those of the preceding line, perception, object, matter. In short, representation in general is divided into two directions that differ in kind, into two pure presences that do not allow themselves to be represented, that of perception, which puts us at once into matter, that of memory, which puts us at once into the mind. Once again, the question is not whether the two lines meet and mix together. This mixture is our experience itself, our representation. But all our false problems derive from the fact that we do not know how to go beyond experience toward the condition of experience, toward the articulations of the real, and rediscover what differs in kind in the composites that are given to us and on which we live. These two acts, perception and recollection, always interpenetrate each other, are always exchanging something of their substance as a process of endoosmosis. The proper office of psychologists would be to dissociate them, to give back to each its natural purity. In this way, many difficulties raised by psychology, and perhaps also by metaphysics, might be lessened. But they will have it that these mixed states, compounded in unequal proportions, of pure perception and pure recollection, are simple. And so we are condemned to an ignorance alike of pure recollection and of pure perception, to knowing only a single kind of phenomenon that will be called now recollection, and now perception, according to the predominance in it of one or other of the two aspects, and consequently to finding between perception and recollection only a difference in degree, and not in kind. Intuition leads us to go beyond the state of experience towards the conditions of experience. But these conditions are neither general nor abstract. They are no broader than the conditioned. They are the conditions of real experience. Bergson speaks of going to seek experience at its source, or rather above that decisive turn, we are taking a bias in the direction of our utility. It becomes properly human experience. Above the turn is precisely the point at which we finally discover differences in kind. But there are so many difficulties in trying to reach this focal point that the acts of intuition, which are apparently contradictory, have to be multiplied. Bergson thus sometimes speaks of a movement that is exactly appropriate to the experience, sometimes a broadening out, sometimes a tightening and narrowing. In the first place, the determination of each line involves a sort of contradiction in which apparently diverse facts are grouped according to their natural affinities, drawn together according to their articulation. But on the other hand, we push each line beyond the turn, to the point where it goes beyond our own experience, an extraordinary broadening out that forces us to think of pure perception identical to the whole of matter, a pure memory identical to the totality of the past. It is in this sense that Bergson, on several occasions, compares the approach of philosophy to the procedure of infinitesimal calculus. When we have benefited in experience from a little light, which shows us a line of articulation, all that remains is to extend it beyond experience, just as mathematicians reconstitute with the infinitely small elements that they perceive of the real curve, the curve itself stretching out into the darkness behind them. In any case, Bergson is not one of those philosophers who ascribes a properly human wisdom and equilibrium to philosophy. To open us up to the inhuman and the superhuman durations which are inferior or superior to our own, to go beyond the human condition. This is the meaning of philosophy, insofar as our condition condemns us to live among badly analyzed composites, and to be badly analyzed composites ourselves. But this broadening out, or even this going beyond, does not consist in going beyond experience towards concepts. For concepts only define, in the Kantian manner, the conditions of all possible experience in general. Here, on the other hand, it is a case of real experience, in all its peculiarities. And if we must broaden it, or even go beyond it, this is only in order to find the articulations on which these peculiarities depend, so that the conditions of experience are less determined in concepts than in pure percepts. And while these percepts themselves are united in a concept, it is a concept modeled on the thing itself, which only suits that thing, and which, in this sense, is no broader than what it must account for. For when we have followed each of the lines beyond the turn in experience, we must also rediscover the point at which they intersect again, where the directions cross, and where the tendencies that differ in kind link together to give rise to the thing as we know it. It might be thought that nothing is easier, and that experience itself has already given us this point, but it is not as simple as that. After we have followed the lines of divergence beyond the turn, these lines must intersect again, not at a point from which we started, but rather at a virtual point, at a virtual image of the point of departure, which is itself located beyond the turn in experience, and which finally gives us the sufficient reason of the thing, the sufficient reason of the composite, the sufficient reason of the point of departure, so that the expression beyond the decisive turn has two meanings. First, it denotes the moment where the lines setting out from an uncertain common point given in experience diverge increasingly according to the differences in kind. Then it denotes another moment when these lines converge again to give us, this time, the virtual image or the distinct reason of the common point, turn and return. Dualism is therefore only a moment, which must lead to the reformation of a monism. This is why after the broadening out, a final narrowing follows, just as integration follows differentiation. We have alluded elsewhere to those lines of fact, each one indicating but the direction of truth, because it does not go far enough. Truth itself, however, will be reached if two of them can be prolonged to the point where they intersect. In our opinion, this method of intersection is the only one that can bring about a decisive advance in metaphysics. There are, therefore, two successive turns in experience, as it were, both in a reverse direction. They constitute what Bergson calls precision in philosophy. Hence, a complementary rule to the second rule. The real is not only that which is cut out, se découpe, according to natural articulations or differences in kind. It is also that which intersects again, se recoupe, long paths converging towards the same ideal or virtual point. The particular function of this rule is to show how a problem, when it is properly stated, tends to be solved of its own accord. For example, still in the first chapter of Matter and Memory, the problem of memory is correctly stated, since starting from the perception-recollection composite, we divide this composite into two divergent and expanded directions, which correspond to a true difference in kind between soul and body, spirit and matter. But we can only reach the solution to the problem by narrowing, when we attain the original point at which the two divergent directions converge again, the precise point at which recollection inserts itself into perception. the virtual point that is like the reflection and the reason of the departure point. Thus the problem of soul and body, of matter and spirit, is only solved by an extreme narrowing in which Bergson shows how the lines of objectivity and of subjectivity, the lines of external observation and of internal experience, must converge at the end of their different processes, all the way to the case of aphasia,